Okay, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Legal Resources Center's panel discussion this morning. This morning, our discussion focuses on a deeply urgent issue: gender, power, and justice in confronting systemic failures in protecting women's rights. Now, we all know that South Africa is on the gripe of a gender-based violence crisis of epidemic proportions. In just the second quarter of 2024, that's last year, 14,000 women were assaulted. Every single day, women and girls endure violence, exploitation, and systemic injustice, often at the hands of those meant to protect them. And when they fight back, when they try and reclaim their survival, the very system that failed them is so swift to punish them. South Africa remains one of the most dangerous countries in the world in which to be a woman. You'd expect our criminal justice system to be equipped to confront this crisis, but instead, women are left with scars of abuse, knowing that their perpetrators walk free, often with impunity. Many are trapped in homes with their abusers. Those who seek justice must endure years of public scrutiny and trauma, only for most to never even see accountability. They return to a society where harassment, violence, and exploitation remain a part of their daily lives. Under these circumstances, it's not difficult to understand why a woman might take power into her own hands and say, "No more, Wanele, enough is enough." Yet when she does, she is met with the full force of the justice system that failed to protect her in the first place. These failures do not stop here. Our education system also leaves women vulnerable. It does not equip them with the knowledge and the skills and the economic independence to break free from these cycles of dependence. Without opportunities, many are forced to exchange their dignity for jobs, promotions, and even basic services. But amidst this injustice, there is hope. At the Legal Resources Center, we refuse to accept this as a norm. Through our sexual and reproductive health rights program, we educate young people about their rights, empowering them with knowledge which they can use in their futures. Our Sextortion program focuses and pushes to extend the definition of corruption to include sexual exploitation, because corruption isn't just about money, it's about power. And through our legal advocacy, we fight to ensure that women who have already survived years of violence are not further punished for defending their lives. Today, we are honored to be joined by Spesihle Mguga, Shanice Linda Boom, Shatira Babu Hasim. These are three extraordinary attorneys at the LRC who are fighting each and every day for justice. So before I continue talking, let these remarkable women, might I point out that we have a panel of all women today, very progressive. Let these three women introduce themselves and just bring them into the conversation. So we'll just start with introductions. Please, in the order that you're sitting in, just let us know who you are, what your name is, the work that you do at the LRC, and why you've chosen to do this work. We're starting off with Spesihle.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. My name is Spesihle Mguga. I'm an attorney at the Legal Resources Center. I'm based in the Makhanda office in the Eastern Cape. So my work primarily focuses on land education, and more recently, we've been looking at equity and equality, particularly sextortion, also known as sexual corruption, and women who kill their abusers. So then why have I chosen to start working on the last two specifically? So I think the answer there is very simple. I've always wanted to help build a society where the ideals and rights that are contained in our Constitution are not just words on paper, but they are a lived reality for all of us. I want to help create a society where no woman ever has to make a decision between, or rather choose between, access to housing or her dignity, right? She can have both. Every single person, especially women, deserves safety, dignity, and justice, and not just as abstract theories, but in their everyday lives. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Shatira Hassam, and I am an attorney at the LRC based here in Johannesburg. Our offices are situated here at Cornhill. I am based in the education focus area, specifically recently also working on sexual and reproductive health rights for girl learners. And I chose to do the work specifically just to always advocate for girl learners, capacitate them with their rights and knowledge and information, which is so crucial in the society we're living in today, so that they can find their voices and empower themselves with knowledge about their rights. Thank you.
Thank you. Morning, everybody. My name is Shanice Lindeboom, and I am an attorney at the Durban office. I'm also on the education team, and also recently with CPE working on gender and equality. I've been in the space now for a while, and I just think it's at my core that the little difference that I can make and contribute to the changes that we want to see. My friends tease me because my tagline is I'm a single mother of 2 young girls, but that really is also my motivation and my drive to create a different future for my children. So I hope to contribute to this conversation.
Thank you so much, ladies, for those introductions. I think all 3 of you, your passion just sticks out and stands out, and it's great to have women who are passionate about the cause, who are qualified and just continue to dedicate their lives to this cause. So starting off with Shanice right at the end. So we all know about the horrific rates of gender-based violence in South Africa. We hear these stats every other day. But something that we don't often talk about is just how early abuse can begin for many of our girls, you know. But the simple truth is that even in a nurturing and safe home, a girl in South Africa cannot escape the pervasive reality of gender-based violence. You would hope that our schooling system at least would provide some sort of relief for young girls, right? But the truth is that, you know, the moment a girl enters the schooling system, she will face challenges that many boys will simply not. So can you tell us, Shanice, could you maybe just describe some of these challenges that young girls face for us, please?
Thank you so much. So I think at the LRC, one of the work areas that we were working on around education is the barriers to education, specifically girl learners. And we had produced our own material and then worked really nicely with the Dropout campaign in helping to sort of supplement a publication that they had put together. And it's really quite shocking when you think about just going to school, the difference that is between boys and girls. So girls dropping out of school is a sort of multifaceted issue, and there's various contributing factors, which include poverty, pregnancy, hygiene, and safety to schools, impacting on their future opportunities. I think in respect of poverty, a girl's ability to attend schools if they are poor and not in sort of rural areas, and in a large household, for example, sending a girl child to school, if not feasible, what you may find is that the girl child might be expected to stay at home while, for example, the boy child will go to school, and that's a small difference that you would see. The duties that is expected of a girl child, house caregiving duties at home. I think we also see, we've heard of stories of menstruation and hygiene in that regard. Some girls would prefer to stay home. We know that menstruation can disrupt learners' schooling in several ways. They sometimes are teased and shamed, but some just feel physically uncomfortable. I think some of the stats we saw in 2018, 1 in 7 menstruating learners in Gauteng reported that they had run short of sanitary products. And in the previous 3 months, prior to being surveyed, these learners were also more likely to miss school during menstruation. And then we know, I think we all know about pregnancies. Gosh, KZN is one of the highest provinces with one of the provinces with the highest pregnancy rates. And the cause and consequence of school dropouts of young women not only can pregnancy prompt learners to leave school, but then those that drop out of school likely will end up getting pregnant. And I think there we see the difference between, again, the boys and the girls. Boys aren't, if fall pregnant, they're not shamed in any way. They can attend school throughout the full duration. Unfortunately, with girls, there's a high chance of them missing schools for the clinic visits. If they're not feeling well, they're not going to have full attendance. I know that we've got the pregnancy policy, which has come out, which really tries to make accommodation for making sure that the learners get to school as soon after as delivering the baby. It doesn't need to be away from school as much as possible, and includes things like a catch-up policy so that the child is able to then catch up on the work that's been missed. But then again, with these policies, a big problem is implementation, and we're not necessarily seeing it being applied throughout the various provinces and throughout the schools. And some schools will still, if they find out the learner's being pregnant, they'll be expelled, which is not something that's meant to be done. And then I suppose what we're going to be speaking about a lot is gender-based violence, but unfortunately we see this even at school level. Part of the workshops that we've been doing has been on educator sexual misconduct, sexual violence in schools, and it's terrible to have to sit in a class at grade 5 and they're talking about their uncle or the neighbor or the father touching them inappropriately and not knowing how and what to do in those circumstances. There was the reports, the same reports I'm talking about spoke about, boys are more susceptible to, for example, physical bullying and the like. But unfortunately, and not to say that boys are exempt from it, but unfortunately, sexual violence at the hands of, educators, fellow classmates, family members, to young girls is unfortunately a problem that we are seeing, and we need to get the numbers down. Thank you.
Thank you, Janice. You had to compete with the national anthem playing in the background there. All right, moving on to Shatira. Shanice spoke a bit about gender-based violence here and there, and it's so funny to me. Well, not funny, but we often think of gender-based violence as applying to adult women, and we don't think of it in the context of children. So it's quite shocking to see how gender-based violence plays out even at a school level. So Shatira, many have described a major issue with dealing with this gender-based violence issue and have encouraged women to come forward and report this abuse. But our stats say that only 1 in 10 women, let's just repeat that, 1 in 10 women actually report their abuse. Shatira, do you maybe believe a lack of comprehension of sexual education plays a role in these low stats that we're seeing, and even in gender-based violence just generally?
So while we have all these days of activism, we see in December that's 16 days of activism and awareness, and there's always campaigns, we still find that there's a lack of education. Sexual education and health rights can significantly, it contributes to why women still face abuse, and girls specifically, and that all, it's a lack of knowledge. So there's not enough knowledge, or women don't know where to find the knowledge, and that leads to them not understanding what actually constitutes abuse and exploitation, and then that leads to a normalization of the abuse. So girls will be faced with something that's inappropriate, but because they don't recognize what it is, because of a lack of education, they just normalize it and they think it's fine to be touched inappropriately in school, at home, or wherever they find themselves. So definitely a lack of education plays a huge role. And there's several organizations such as ourselves and other social justice groups that, we advocate and we campaign, but we find that it's not enough. We're all dealing with the same scourge, and we're going into schools and, we're putting together information and toolkits. But when we're speaking to learners, we find that a simple thing like knowing where or who to reach out to. They don't know. They don't have that contact information at hand, and that leads to a young girl learner having or being coerced into a situation where she cannot recognize what abuse is. And then there's also the power dynamics. And women don't understand power dynamics, especially in the culture and societies we live in, where you think a man, is dominant and so forth. We're all faced with that, right? It's how we grew up or what we're facing, the stigmas around all of that. So they often find, and they cannot recognize when they're being manipulated or even coerced into a situation. You think it's fine, And then also we find that there's not enough resources available. Especially in certain schools where there's not enough counseling or social outreach programs for learners in disadvantaged schools, or quintile 1 schools is what we call them, compared to a school that is more well-resourced with information. So it's really difficult, and that's why we're here today, to continue with the work we're doing and to create platforms for people to reach out to and for awareness especially. Because the lack of knowledge, even in 2025, is a huge difficulty that we see. Thank you.
Shatira, I love how you point out how abuse or gender-based violence is often entrenched in our various cultures and traditions. And because we've normalized culture and tradition, we don't often see it. So there's definitely a need for education and just general sensitization. Coming to you, Sipe, do you feel that the judicial system plays a role in all of this? I mean, the worst moment of a woman's life is often dragged through the mud, often for years, before a woman can see any real justice. And again, only 8.6% of these women will ever see a conviction. Let that sink in for a second. Only 8.6 of the 1 in 10 women who report these matters will ever see justice. Truly shocking. I know that the criminal justice system makes provision for children with mediators to help reduce secondary victimization. But are women, older women, afforded the same protections, do you find?
Thank you very much, Zanele, for that question. So, interestingly enough, the Criminal Procedure Act does have these protective mechanisms available to victims of sexual offences or victims of gender-based violence. And the ones that I'm aware of, I'm going to share them with you today. But I'd also like to pose a question to the audience to ask, number one, have you ever heard about any of the protective mechanisms that I'm going to share with you today? I'll ask you this question at the end, maybe by a show of hands, you can just share with us. So a victim of sexual offense can use or give evidence via an intermediary, right? So an intermediary is a person who facilitates the communication between the witness and the court, right? That's number one. And then number two is you can give evidence via a CCTV or behind a screen. And then number three, you can ask for your matter to be heard in a closed courtroom or in camera. I think most people here know that a lot of criminal trials are open to the public, right? And the media, you can come and watch, but the prosecutor can make an application for the matter to be heard in a closed courtroom. So then I guess some people might ask, then why is it that we don't see or we've never heard of these protective mechanisms? And I think that there is a lack of awareness, right? People, number one, don't know that these exist, right? And then also, I don't think that the NPA is adequately funded, and that results in like prosecutors running quite a number of trials all at once, and they might not necessarily remember to present these options. Because in order for a witness to make use of any of them, the prosecutor has to make a formal application to the court, setting out reasons as to why this witness wants to give evidence in a closed courtroom, or they would like to give evidence using an intermediary, right? And some of the things that they will have to set out in that application is that being in the same room as the accused is going to cause you emotional distress, or you are suffering from post-traumatic disorder, and being in the same room as the accused is going to make matters worse, it's going to make your condition worse. So then what would happen is the court would consider such an application and then either grant or reject that application, but I've never heard of instances where it's been rejected. But then again, you find that some courts in the rural areas, right, they don't have these facilities. So even if the victim can give evidence, let's say using an intermediary, there aren't any intermediaries because of a lack of funding, or there is no CCTV because that specific court doesn't have those facilities. So then I think that if the NPA and our courts were adequately funded, and victims knew that when giving evidence, you don't have to be in the same room as the accused, right? You don't have to give evidence in front of so many people, that you can give evidence in a closed courtroom, that a lot more people would come forward. So I think we need to bring about public awareness about these protective mechanisms. And now before I hand over to you, just by a show of hands, how many people here have heard about any of these protective mechanisms that I just shared?
Organization committed to
Okay, all right.
While advocating,
That was just two people. That is not enough. But also shocking is to see how the NPA, and you mentioned courts as well, and other authorities who are meant to be the guardians and the custodians of our rights are often uninformed or misinformed or just plain ignorant about these structures that are meant to protect people, and the ones who are meant to know just do not know. That is quite sad. But before I let you go, I do have a follow-up question. So we know that abuse often for many girls comes as their bodies start to change, often even before that. But yeah, as they grow older, this unwanted attention increases, and so does their risk for harm, right? Unfortunately, this risk doesn't always disappear with age. It often follows them into adulthood, especially as they try to access essential services like housing or employment, One of the biggest but least talked about barriers that they face is sextortion. Sipe, can you just explain to all of us in the room what exactly is sextortion?
Okay, so in South Africa, there are two definitions of sextortion first, right? So we have sextortion that I think most people here have heard about. That is the sextortion where a person has intimate images of you, and then they threaten that if you don't do A, B, C, D, they're going to publish those on social media, right? So we believe that that kind of sextortion is adequately catered for in our law, and that's not the sextortion we're here to talk about today. So the sextortion we're here to talk about today, the term was first coined by the International Association of Women Judges, and it involves a person in a position of power abusing that power to demand a sexual favor, right? So it is a form of corruption where the currency of the bribe is not money but sex. Right? So that's the kind of sextortion that we're talking about. It is a form of corruption. So the most appropriate term, that's why I think most organizations that are working on sextortion are moving away from calling it sextortion, but rather calling it sexual corruption.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. I just wonder how many of our audience members have heard of the term sextortion, maybe just by show of hands. Okay, two people. Three. Okay, we have another question from one of our panelists. Go ahead.
Sorry, so I just wanted to find out again. So now that you've heard about these two definitions of sextortion, right? If you ever witnessed the second kind of sextortion, would you know where to report that? Sorry, thank you.
Thank you to our audience members. Okay, moving on now to Shanice. So, Shanice, from what I understand, it can often be argued that women have an element of choice, right? But do they really? Looking at the circumstances and how these issues often play out, can we really say that they have a choice? And do you think that the history of marginalization plays any role in any of this?
Just a jurist and legal scholar.
Sorry about that. Yeah. No, we can't. I think the saying is, are you really choosing when you're stuck between a rock and a hard place? And I don't think that it's true choice, true unadulterated consent in these instances. there was for a real life example, Professor Williams from the University of Stellenbosch presented an example of a woman who was on the waiting list for an RDP house, and she was approached by a man who told her that she was at the top of the waiting list, and then he politely walked into the house and laid on the bed and said that sexual favor would need to occur for the deal to be sealed. She was shocked, declined, and has not received that house and still living in a shack. So I don't think it's true. Yeah, it really is, like Sipe said in the beginning, you're choosing between basic services and your right to dignity. I think as the LRC, we've been fortunate to be engaging with a lot of organizations that are working in this space of sextortion as well as BWS. I think we believe that collaboration with organizations that have significant experience is something that we take pride in. And I think as a collective, the discussions have been really interesting because we are still trying to figure out we know that where the legal gaps are, but in terms of figuring out what the way forward is, we're still trying to navigate what was going to work best. There's a few options. But at a recent seminar that we attended on this, one of the proposals was use the current language that is there, which is rape, because it's coercion. You're making the decision, you're consenting under duress. And this is still under debate because in terms of strategically what would be the best, move, to address the specific gaps relating to sextortion, for example, we need to think about that carefully. And for example, in the example that we've given, where CP asked, where do you go? The current legislation would criminalize the person who is giving the bribe and the person receiving the bribe. So, yeah, there's been a lot of discussions around this and what's the best way to try and work on it. But yeah, we'll get into that a little bit later. But yeah, it's not really.
It's just as a concept. Could you maybe unpack these limitations for us and just help us to understand what are the circumstances where there are gaps in our legal system and what needs to happen in order to ensure that women are safe moving forward?
All right, so if we go back to the example that Shanice shared, right, about the woman who was on the RDP waiting list. So if we go to that example, our current anti-corruption legislative framework fails to protect that woman, right? And the reason we say that is PRECA, which is the Preventing and Combating of Corrupt Activities Act, it criminalizes corruption, rightfully so, but it criminalizes both the corruptor and the corruptee, right? So then if the woman in our example there had complied with the demand and slept with the official and then thereafter reported the incident, she would also be prosecuted as a co-conspirator to corruption. So that's why we say that the law as it currently stands fails to protect her, right? So those are some of the limitations. And when we started doing this work, we find that other organizations as well are saying we should all advocate for sexual corruption to be criminalized. And at the moment, we are faced with two options. And the one I think Shanice mentioned, that we should amend our existing laws, right? So we can try and amend the Prevention and Combating of Corrupt Activities Act to include sexual corruption, but without inadvertently criminalizing the corruptee as well, right? That's like one of our options. Or we can also amend our Sexual Offences Act. So that's the first option, just amending existing laws. Or the second option could be to try and develop an entire legislative framework that just deals with sexual corruption. Because that's the other thing. Sexual corruption doesn't happen only in public service or in the provision of basic services. we see it manifest in very, very different ways. For example, we've heard of stories of lecturers now demanding sex for marks. We've heard of students demanding sex for accommodation. And there was this other horrible story that Uzakona, who is leading Awaken, she said that, I think this happened sometime last year, young lady posted on, I think it was Facebook, right? Something along the lines of, if you want a job at this municipality, who do you sleep with, right? That was the post. And the most frightening thing is that instead of people being shocked by that question, people responded with names. He said, no, this is the person that you sleep with to get a job at that municipality, right? So now that's the other scary thing, that it's become part of our society. People have become to accept this is just, the way it goes. And I've heard as well of people, like, let's say you apply for a job, you qualify for the job, you get called for an interview, but then after the interview you will be asked to do something else in order to guarantee that you get that job. So essentially what we're trying to do is, number one, criminalize sextortion, but we're still trying to figure out what the best way to do that is. Is it amending our existing rules, or should we try and develop a different legislation that just focuses on sexual corruption?
It seems you've just brought up what Shatira mentioned earlier in the conversation when she spoke about how we've normalized a lot of these issues, and it's just, it's like it doesn't even, conjure up any feelings of shock anymore. Like, we've just been shocked by this happening so many time and time again that it just becomes part of our everyday lives, which is quite concerning and scary. You're right, it is scary. And you mentioned this issue of going back to the drawing board entirely, and perhaps even an overhaul of our legislation as it exists in order to properly define corruption as an abuse of power, not just money, not just personal gratification, but an abuse of power at its core. So coming to you, Shanice, similarly, when a woman acts in self-defense, the law fails to recognize the trauma and the history of abuse as it pertains to that woman. What reforms are needed in our legal system to ensure that we acknowledge the realities of gender-based violence and the history and trauma that is attached to it?
That made me smile. But it's part of our heritage and we must preserve it.
Hello? Okay. Yeah, so here too, we're also trying to figure out what would be the best way of doing it. But what we need to see is the criminal justice system properly taking into account the trauma and the history and what would drive a person to do such, to commit a crime like that, and to properly take into account the lived reality, the lived experience of these individuals. We have been looking at some sort of comparative jurisdictions, some countries where they do have BWS as they recognize it either as a defense, or it can be used in mitigation for example, a sentence. So it can be used to get a lesser sentence, for example. And we've seen in countries like Australia and Brazil and America, there's been some initiatives around and recognition of the history of abuse that has led to the particular criminal act. And I mean, in these instances, you would obviously need to have significant evidence, which would come from a psychiatrist or a psychologist that properly has the qualifications to do so. But I think, I mean, if we get to that point where we can start seeing where we can get actual changes on paper, again, I think it's about understanding, awareness and education to the authorities, like you said. I mean, dare we say that, that they're incompetent, but it's about, understanding, because I think what was also quite shocking in this instance, the example that I mentioned was that the magistrate that sentenced this woman in the Cal's case was a woman herself. And not to say that we must, give women a pass, but it really was just a little bit like, you get a little bit taken aback. So, we hope to see those cases, to see those changes. Looking on cases, there have been cases in other countries where they've drawn on that history of abuse, which is warranted for a mitigation of sentence. And we'd be looking to pull out those examples so that we could see if it similarly could be applied, in our jurisdiction. And we hope that would make that change. But definitely, and I think in parallel with that, we'd be wanting to do as much education within the NPA, and talking to magistrates around how it's applied and the like. So lots of work to be done, but we're working with some great organizations to try and see sort of what steps and efforts we can make for this change.
Shanice, you point to other jurisdictions who have implemented this and who have, amended their legislation or whatever else to take these matters into consideration. And I think that points to the fact that it is possible. It is being done elsewhere and there are models that we can replicate. I think what it will just require is an interdisciplinary approach, because you speak of psychologists and psychiatrists. It just seems like an all hands on deck kind of undertaking. Okay, moving to Shatira. So even when women and girls try and take, control of their reproductive health, they often face many roadblocks, whether it's stigma around contraception, whether it's schools refusing to provide comprehensive sex education, whether it's barriers to termination of pregnancies, access, the list goes on. Why are these issues still so difficult to navigate in 2025?
So I think it all comes back to sensitivity. I was at an engagement last week where we just spoke about everyone needing a sensitivity workshop, from magistrates and the police and caregivers and schools and everyone else, just around this whole discussion. Because often we find that all these factors are interconnected. Male dominance plays a huge role in why girls feel or women feel restricted or discriminated against when we're looking at access to all things like contraception, for example, in school. The stigma is still there that, you have to do everything secretively, or people shouldn't know because if they find out you will be ostracized, or, there's discrimination against you. And it all links to the fact that Shanice mentioned, where it will lead to a girl learner dropping out of school because now she's pregnant. What do you do? Where do you go? So I think the factors are so interconnected, and without there being a sensitivity around it, policy reform and all of those other reforms won't take place without there being a change of mind from politicians to everyone else, to teachers and learners themselves, from boy learners in schools. Things won't change without a sensitivity, aspect attached to it. So, and because of that, obviously, there's always a fear of judgment that learners, girls especially in school, find themselves facing. Communities as well. It's hard for a girl learner to speak out about what she's going through because of your community you're living in. That plays a huge role. There's shame and guilt you feel in society. And then just even approaching a healthcare facility to discuss the difficulty you're facing. Often you find that, you're too scared to do that because of the social norms in your community and what would happen to you should people find out. So I think even though it's 2025 and we've got all of us working on this so extensively, the issue is around sensitivity and how do we change that? That's why we're here to talk about that. So that we can obviously move forward with all the other fantastic organizations and better the system that we're all facing.
Right, Shatiran, you're so right in saying that everyone needs to be brought on board. Everyone has to be included. It's definitely an all-of-society approach that needs to be taken when dealing with this matter. And staying on you, Shatira, we've discussed how difficult it is for, a woman to seek justice, whether it's a victim of sextortion, whether she's trapped in an abusive relationship, or whether she's trying to access sexual and reproductive health rights services, right? But real change starts by breaking the silence. How can we create safe spaces for young girls to speak about their experiences and to access the support that they need? And what are we trying to do about these issues?
So again, I think it leads back to what we mentioned earlier, just the sensitivity around it. For a girl or a woman to know that if she does approach any facility or organization, that there's some sort of confidentiality and safe space for her to actually speak up. Confidentiality again interlinks with the stereotypes and the norms in society. So if I know I'm going to be safe and what I say is confidential between myself and a counselor, for example, I'd feel more I'd feel more positive to speak out. It leads back to what CP says. People don't know what the justice system looks like when they do report their abuse, or that there is a support system in place for them. So I think it's just more education, more advocacy, so that women know that they can speak out and there are safe spaces to do so. And also, whoever you speak to, we need to make sure that there are trained facilitators, trained healthcare professionals to take down your information and provide you with the advice that is required and correct advice. So that when I go to a hospital, for example, the nurse is not going to just chase me away or give me the incorrect advice. She's going to see to me, it's confidential, I have the right advice. She can point me to another facility where I need counseling, and it's all interlinked. So we need that platforms to ensure that people speak up more, women come forward so that we can address these issues. And in that way, the law can also be reformed better once they know that there are these safe spaces for them to approach.
Right, those platforms are very important, and I think it's quite interesting to note that South Africa has over 200,000 non-profit organizations who are dedicated to supporting women and children, yet despite their efforts, I think we can all agree that we still have quite a distance to walk. Sipe, who are we partnering with? Which one of these 200,000 non-profits are we partnering with in our projects and in just the work that we do? And who else is working on sextortion and women who kill their abusers?
Okay, so the LRC started looking into this work about 19 months ago, if not longer. And when we started doing the work, we did a situation analysis that included a very comprehensive stakeholder mapping. And then we identified GIZ, Corruption Watch, and this amazing organization that I mentioned earlier called it's African Women Network Against Corruption, which is affectionately known as Awaken, being headed by Uzakwana Mvelase. So around sextortion, we've been working with them, and just recently, I think it was about 3 weeks ago, maybe a month ago, they launched the national survey on sextortion. Right, because that's the other thing. When we did our research, we found out that there isn't a lot of information around sextortion. So they've just launched this national survey, which I believe is going to inform quite a number of our interventions in the future. It means around women who kill. I think the only other organization that's specifically looking at that is CALS, and I think Shanice has already spoken about that. But the other organizations that we've been engaging with are Lawyers Against Abuse, Power, which is people opposing women abuse, and then I think Tears as well. This is just around gender-based violence in general, because we believe that collaboration truly forms the daily fabric of social justice. And I was kind of looking forward, I am looking forward to engaging with some of you today, and maybe you can help us not only contribute to putting these distressing topics under the spotlight, so help us come up with creative and innovative ways on how to address them. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Sipin. Thank you for that, ladies. I think today's conversation, we can all agree, has been quite insightful. And it's just made one thing abundantly clear, that whether it's sextortion, whether it's women being forced to defend themselves against their abusers, or whether it's the ongoing struggle for sexual and reproductive health rights, the very systems that are meant to protect women are often the ones that fail them. But failure doesn't mean that we stop fighting, right? It means that we push harder for legal reform, for accountability, and for real lasting change in our society. Now, the work of the LRC is just one step in this fight, but the real change happens when the conversation and conversations like this are turned into real action. Okay, thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. That brings us to the end of our conversation. From sextortion to women who kill their abusers to sexual and reproductive health rights, I think we can all agree that gender, power, and justice is a very complex and convoluted issue. There's still a lot of work that needs to be done. But I hope that this conversation will be a call to action to all of us in whatever work we do, whether in our professional, personal lives. To our panelists, Shanice, Shatira, Sipe, you ladies have been phenomenal. Thank you so much for your insights. Thank you for sharing the work that you do. To our audience, you've been spectacular. Thank you for the questions. And just thank you for all the work that you do in your personal lives as well. I think you've mentioned a number of initiatives that you're a part of. So yeah, with that, we've come to the end of our conversation, and thank you.